right. I think we will go ahead and get started. So, good afternoon and welcome to Bridging the Divide, a panel discussion on library workers' loneliness. My name is Christine Krieger, and I am the professional development consultant for the Colorado State Library. And I'm going to be your tech support for this session, as well as helping to monitor chat as we move through the session. The session is being recorded, and I should have enabled automatic captions. I will double check that in just a moment, that you can turn on as needed. You can feel free to keep your video on or off as you feel comfortable. We will ask that you remain muted until the open Q&A portion of the session, but do feel free to put questions as we go in the chat, and we will make note of that and make sure that those get asked when we get to that point. So with that, it is my pleasure to turn the session over to Alejandro Marquez, who will provide a couple more housekeeping details and introduce the panel.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Alejandro. Before we begin today's session, I just want to acknowledge that we're going to be talking about content that's going to be very heavy and depressing at times. We're going to be talking about job satisfaction, low morale, constructive criticism of the workplace. And so take a moment of self-care if you need it. We're going to be recording the session again. And so if it gets to be too much, you can always watch the recording later. So for our introductions, again, my name is Alejandro. I'm the Science and Engineering librarian here at the University of Denver Libraries, and I'll be the moderator of this panel. And we're going to have, I'm going to kick it off to Beth to introduce herself next.
Hello. I'm going to apologize for my voice ahead of time. I am recovering from the December cold that is going around Colorado right now. So my name is Beth Garbosi, pronouns she, her, and I'm the circulation supervisor at Aurora Central Public Library. And why I wanted to be on this session, this panel, I think this is a really important topic that's gotten even more prevalent post-pandemic, and it is something that I've experienced in my own work life. So yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Claudette Castellanos. I was born in Guatemala, Central America. I am the Spanish service librarian at the Loveland Public Library in Colorado. And I am interested in this topic because by recognizing and addressing our own loneliness, we as librarians can better understand and emphasize with patrons experiencing similar feelings. Thank you.
Kara, do you want to go next?
Yes, hello everyone. Kara Lucas is my name. I'm an outreach librarian at Front Range Community College, Westminster campus. And I have an interest in this topic because I've observed that loneliness has increased ever since the pandemic. And it just is a topic I have an interest in, and I think it can help me relate to some students whom I observe experiencing loneliness. Thank you.
Marie, do you want to go next?
Sure, thanks, Alejandro. My name is Marie Beyer, and I am with Jefferson County Public Library. I work at the Lakewood location, and I'm the adult librarian there. And my pronouns are she, her. And I'm interested in this topic because, as others have mentioned, during the pandemic, I think it became more and more apparent that working from home and being apart from our colleagues that we're used to being with day to day, we experience loneliness. And as Kara mentioned, working with students, you can empathize with their loneliness, and I too with all the patrons who are in the library. So, thank you.
I'm Rachel Hansen. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Human Resources Director at Mesa County Libraries in Grand Junction, Colorado. This topic interests me because I feel like it's one of the less talked about subtopics of mental health. And I'm also really concerned about true inclusivity in the workplace. And I think we can do a lot of work to improve inclusivity and loneliness at the same time.
All right. So for the format of this session, we'll be doing 8 pre-selected questions, and then we'll be opening up the floor to question and answer. Feel free to add any questions to the chat box, and we'll get to them at that question and answer session. And Christine will be gathering them. So for our first question, is what are your initial thoughts or reactions to the claim that prolonged isolation is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day? So Kara, if you want to take that one. Looks like you're muted.
My apologies. Is this okay now? Yes, that definitely is a claim which I agree with. Prolonged isolation can have very detrimental mental and physical health impacts, which I will discuss in a little bit. So when I think of chronic loneliness or isolation, I tend to think of it as a lack of resources, whether they be mental, emotional, or even financial, or a social circle which people have to meet their social needs. There was a 2018 study that the Pew Research Center conducted, and it connected frequent loneliness to isolation and disconnectedness with one's family, one's social, and one's community life. I should note that this feeling of a disconnect often tends to be something that's more common in single, older people, low income, minorities, and the LGBT and Q community, as these are often marginalized groups already. So without the support of family and friends, one often observes that one's anxiety levels, depression, and one's stress levels tend to be very elevated. According to the Mental Health Foundation, unhealthy behaviors and one's risk of suicide and of developing Alzheimer's also increase. Now, moving on to the physical health impacts, according to the Surgeon General, prolonged isolation can increase one's risk of heart attack and of developing a stroke. And here's an interesting study which was conducted by Stephen Cole. He's a medical doctor and professor of medicine at UCLA. And in his study, he found that lonely patients have genes which have more expression with inflammation and fewer antiviral genes. So one can look at that and say that with elevated inflammation and fewer antivirals, then that means that one's flight or fight response is elevated. And obviously that will negatively impact your immune system functioning, which the implication of that is that you will be more prone towards frequent sickness. I feel that loneliness ebbs and flows throughout one's life. It often peaks in the 20s. This is an age when people are moving away from their parents' home. They're entering a new world in their college campus, and in their 60s. The 60s is an age when many are retiring and they're seeing kind of a closing down of their workplace and sometimes the connections which they made there. Many elderly are dependent on the television or radio for company. Likewise, though, I do see in many younger people that they're overly dependent on social media. I do feel that society now is increasingly fragmented and that many blame themselves for being lonely. I think there's a real sense of stigma and shame in admitting to being lonely, and there really shouldn't be, and that's why I think that talks like this are so important.
Thank you so much. So question number 2, how do you define loneliness in the context of the workplace? What are some of the common factors or situations? And Claudette, why don't you take this one?
Yes. So I define loneliness as the feeling of this feeling disconnected or isolated from our coworkers, despite being physically present. In the work environment. Some common factors are the lack of meaningful interactions, maybe feelings of being undervalued or unheard, a sense of not belonging to the workplace community. Also, the ineffective communication that happens sometimes between teams can also create a sense of exclusion. And sometimes our own perception, and I don't want to minimize the feeling of being lonely, but sometimes maybe we are going through situations at home, and so we are more sensitive to other people interactions with us. And also there are some many differences in values of interests. Maybe we feel different from our coworkers in terms of our background, our values, or interests, and so that can be part of struggling with connecting with others. Mm.
All right, thank you so much. So question number 3, have you ever experienced loneliness in your professional life? What were the circumstances and how did it impact you? And Rachel, why don't you kick this one off?
Sure. I have felt loneliness in my professional life a few times. The first time was towards the beginning of my career at the library. I was just out of college. I was a library assistant. The team was great. I had friendships. We had a lot of fun. But there was the woman in charge had a really strong personality, and there was another friend of hers in the department. And so many of the conversations were around her life and in her manner. She was very boisterous. And as Claudette was talking about, that's just not who I was. So I wasn't insincere in my presentation. I just had to put on or be somebody that wasn't naturally me the entire time. Um, and I realized I was just operating at a different level than I was comfortable with, and their life was just different than mine. When I got hired into another department, I remember thinking, I'm excited to see who I am at work because I wasn't fully myself in that department. So I felt loneliness as a new worker trying to figure out life as an adult and life in a new workplace. I've also felt loneliness as a manager. I had a great team, again, great relationships, a lot of fun, healthy relationships, good communication. But managers are also simply separate and they can't talk about things, everything with their departments, and their departments, people on the team need to have separate conversations from them. I think managers, sometimes you have a great manager friend you can discuss a lot with, but then there's also personnel issues. So even if you have a best manager friend at the organizational level, there are still things that you might not be able to discuss. And then you can only discuss it with your supervisor, who is also separate and different than you are. So I've had it at different levels and for different reasons. And then the impact is when I feel lonely, I withdraw, which of course doesn't really help the situation because I just become more independent and more um, into myself. And so that's the impact. And of course, when you withdraw and become separate, there are other impacts and results of that, which we'll discuss later, I know, as part of these topics. Thankfully, I am surrounded by good relationships. And so even if I don't go and seek those healthy relationships, some conversation or interaction thankfully draws me out of that sense of loneliness where I currently am.
All right, question number 4. What role do team dynamics play in either alleviating or exacerbating feelings of loneliness? And Beth, you can kick this one off.
Yeah. Thank you. So in my research on all of this, there's a lot of different factors at play with the team dynamics, and there's a lot of things that we have to consider when existing in teams and building teams. So number one thing is crucial to remember is that yourself and the members of your team are people first, and everyone is bringing their own experiences into the conversation. We don't exist in a bubble at work where we're just our work persona. We have experiences, mental health. We have different identities that we're all bringing into our team, which can make those dynamics very challenging. You may have a really strong, tight-knit team, but then one or two people may feel very isolated from that team because they feel other or they feel that they don't fit in. And you have to think about a lot of different factors like like personality traits, mental health conditions, identity, race, gender, disability, etc., socioeconomic factors, LGBTQIA plus individuals, and then your part-time versus full-time people on your teams. And I personally have worked in some difficult team dynamics. I've worked on teams where maybe one person is a person of color or part of the LGBTQIA community, and it's very difficult for them in those teams where they feel that they're the only person. And then also I've worked in teams where there's a large socioeconomic disparity between team members who, and I feel like this happens a decent amount in libraries, where you have team members who are working part-time jobs because they love it, not that they need to be the sole breadwinner for their family or themselves. And then you have people on the team who are the sole breadwinner for either their family or themselves. And this is very much a career, and they may be struggling with financial issues because of pay disparity in this profession. So that is all dynamics that are at play. And I just wanted to bring a couple psychology theories that I found into the conversation as well. So one is attachment theory, which theorizes that the bonds we form early in life with our caregivers will affect significantly influence our ability to build healthy relationships in the future as adults. And in the workplace context, that means if you have people who have insecure attachment styles, who have struggles, they may really struggle to form strong bonds and close relationships with their colleagues. And then social identity theory further illustrates how your memberships in various social groups impact your experiences of belonging. And all of this for marginalized employees and communities can be amplified by lack of representation and understanding. Excuse me. And so all of this to point out that workplaces that are lacking in robust DEI initiatives and understanding and inclusive policies, they may have a lot of people on their teams and in their workplace who struggle.
Thanks so much. So our 5th question is, are libraries or certain library job roles that may be more susceptible to loneliness, and why? And Rachel, why don't you kick this one off?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, I think managers are particularly susceptible because they're part of a team, but they're also separate from their team. And they may or may not know other managers as well to have those conversations that keep us from being lonely. As I was thinking about it, I was thinking about how a lot of managers and middle managers also have that delicate balance of representing their team members and also representing the organization. And I think having to straddle that line and not just having to have that balance in both perspectives can leave people feeling outside or other and therefore maybe lonely. Um, and then there are some other job roles I was thinking about that could be susceptible to loneliness. The first one goes back to is the question about libraries as an industry being susceptible, making people susceptible to loneliness. And I think that's true. Our library cultures are so strong. And so for the positions where people have experience in other industries and then they're coming into the library for the first time, trying to understand our expectations and our language and just our culture. I think that can create a lot of loneliness. I've seen people in our marketing and communications departments come from a different industry background, people in the human resources department, and just trying to learn and fit in can really be a challenge for people. And then also people in branch locations or remote locations can also be susceptible to loneliness, even if they're part of a bigger team. Um, there's a whole library, especially if you have we have a central library with branches. And so the branch people, they hardly, rarely, maybe once or twice a month interact with people at the central library. And there are people they never see and they never get to know. And even within their own branch department, there are people who don't interact often. So I think that can be a big problem. Um, and finally, is kind of what Beth was saying about the disparities even within a certain team. I was thinking about the educational differences, requirements that can be in one team. So at my library, we have information services and there are librarians and library assistants. And so just by the nature, even if everybody's respected equally, there are different goals and there are different backgrounds and different expectations of people in those positions. I worked with a woman who was a library assistant, but her peers were the librarians because of her age and education. And so I assume there are times when she was lonely because most of her peers were talking about focusing different things. But then the people who were actually in her shared position were younger than she was and weren't her direct life peers. So I think that those situations and those positions are ones that are more susceptible to loneliness within the library.
All right. One other category I'm thinking of myself is the on-call and contingent workers and how we rely so much in libraries to feel like those weird, when people are sick or on the weekends, and how, a lot of people don't really feel like they are part of the culture when they're only there for an hour or two a week or a month. And so really thinking about going back to that economic disparity too, of how, they're paid so much less. And so they're really trying to be part of the culture, but they're also not part of it. And so thinking about them too.
That's a
Uh,
great, sorry.
Go ahead.
We have an adult learning center and those instructors are grant funded. So we do everything possible to include them as the same employees in many ways. But there are those small little things that are a little different. And one is longevity because their grants would be interrupted. So we finally try to include, like count their longevity over the years. So they weren't here for 7 years, but only had 2 years of longevity and never got the longevity acknowledgement. So we don't have temporary workers, but they're also an other category that's not fully the same.
All right. So question number 6, what strategies or initiatives can managers implement to promote social interaction and a sense of community amongst their team members? And Maria, do you want to kick this one off?
Sure, thanks, Alejandro. And I do see your point too about temporary workers, or what we call substitutes, who work the floor when somebody's sick or on vacation. And yes, it does take an effort to reach out to those people, to include them on your team. Here in Jefferson County, when they're here in the building, we include them on our team chats so they know what's going on the floor when they're helping patrons. And also, I have been a substitute myself in other library systems, and I do feel like I just come in and do what's asked of me, and really it doesn't feel like anybody really interacts with me while I was there. So that does kind of made me feel isolated, because I wasn't there very often, but I was included in their annual holiday party. So they did acknowledge me. It's just like they were too busy to do so at the actual time that I was there. So that's a good point. Strategies or initiatives that managers could implement to promote social interaction and a sense of community among their team members are team building activities. Especially if you're having a staff meeting, you could start off with an icebreaker that might reveal personal information about each person. Two truths and a lie is always a good one, so that people can figure out if they really do know you. And planning social activities outside of the workplace are also a good way to get to know your team members better. Of course, not everybody can and will take advantage of that, but the effort has been made. Or potlucks in the workplace, so you kind of know like what your coworkers' favorite dishes are, what they're good at cooking. Or we even have friendly competitions. For instance, here at the Lakewood Library, for our holiday open house, we do an annual festival of trees, and patrons can make a tree. And we have some parameters so that they're not too big or don't require electricity and all of that. So patrons can enter, but there's also a staff category. So it's always interesting to see what the staff come up with. And be sure when something is getting implemented on your team that you ask for feedback from everyone. So that gives everybody a chance for their voice to be heard and gives them a chance to share. That's all I have on that.
I'm not a supervisor, so this may not qualify, but I know, especially during the early days of the pandemic, I was feeling quite isolated from the rest of the team, working from home, which I still do, and it can still be a challenge. But I know that first year when we had to draft our goals for the year, I was just sort of at a loss. Like, the pandemic's happening. What am I even doing here? Like, there was like a whole existential crisis. And so I brought the consultants at the state library together. In my opinion, I was like, hey, let's talk about our goals, which of course everybody was just like, no, that's boring. So, but what that turned into is a monthly meeting that we just call Boost, where we get together and talk about whatever. You show up if you can, you don't have to, everybody's invited. I'll have people show up once a year, but I started it 3 years ago and it still happens. We talk about books and movies and that kind of thing. So it's kind of like a way to do that water cooler conversation. And for those, because most library staff obviously are in the libraries, when you do have your staff meetings and things, maybe there's a way where the first 5 minutes can be just sort of that water cooler moment, that chit chat. And if people, that also gives people maybe a 5 minute window, like if they're not into that, which is fine, or if they're finishing something, they're not missing part of the meeting, but it's just sort of like the standing, let's get to know each other sort of part.
And I see in the comments that people wrote that they have a staff book club. There's a hot cocoa bar. We're in our library, we're going to try to do a plant exchange in the spring. And so really thinking about what are those small things that we can do to kind of promote connection and kind of interaction amongst people. I've seen departments do open houses to get more people to kind of see the work we're doing. I know a lot of times, things happen in technical services or access, and we're like, well, who works there? What do they do? And so really thinking about what are those small things that maybe not cost a lot of money to really promote that interaction. And does anyone else on the panel have any other ideas that they do or have seen done?
I did see Laura's comment about the staff book club, and during the pandemic, our staff did try a book club. I think more people actually had time to read. Working in a library, we never have time to read, but it worked a lot better. We tried doing it virtually, and then we did it in. Excuse me, I also have the cold that Beth has. Then we did it social distancing in somebody's backyard. And it's kind of fizzled since the pandemic is gone and work is interrupting.
Well, and I also see a comment, what's interesting is that the same people who always ends up coming to those types of events, which I think is an astute observation. It could be, and I'm not saying that it's entirely this, but there are people who are more extroverted, more introverted to that kind of thing. And so, maybe it's a matter of thinking of things that can be done together, but not necessarily together, if that makes sense, like where you can share things without having everybody in the same room. Because I think people are also still, as a result of the pandemic, we're still a little bit overworked and tired and a little burnt out and that kind of thing. And so while people may yearn for connection, it can still be hard because people are also like, literally, all I want to do is go and read a book somewhere and like not talk to people. So I think these ideas are great, and I'm gonna post the ideas along with the archive that you guys have suggested. But yeah, like there's all kinds of reasons why people might not want to attend. Sometimes it just seems like too much.
And in terms of passive programming, I think the gratitude tree I've heard people do with great success. So that way you can do that. A decorating station, especially around the holidays or even Valentine's Day. So thinking about things that you can do away from people, I think is also a great reminder for us, for all of our introvert friends who might need some extra help. Um, so for question number 7, how can remote work arrangements contribute to or alleviate feelings of loneliness in the workplace? And Marie, I want to take this one. Oh, it looks like you're muted.
I clicked it, there it goes. Well, I think as Christine mentioned, I think all of us were working remote during the pandemic. And right now I very rarely get to work remotely. So I kind of have to think back during that time. So it was very odd at the beginning of the pandemic working remotely when there weren't a lot of tasks to do. Like, what are we doing? And our team was a very close-knit team. We supported each other, helping out patrons and each other in general. And everything got thrown into chaos. So we didn't have patrons to assist placing holds or locating items on the shelves, or printing from their computers or phones, or presenting programs and story times. But the librarians were still expected to work. So it took a little while to figure out what that would actually look like. I took that opportunity to take online classes, webinars, and other training courses to catch up on things that I really didn't have time for before. I did interact with folks during those things via Zoom, but it was only an hour or two, and then I was back on my own. And when I look back on that time, I did feel a bit lonely. I supplemented my personal social life. I would take walks outside with friends that didn't work at my library or even any library. And my family also started at that time to do monthly Zoom calls to stay connected as we lived all over the country. And my husband and I even tried virtual brunches with a couple of other couples. So we would all just, of course, cook our own meals, and then we would get out our computers and eat and talk about what we had cooked and how we enjoyed that and caught up on what everybody was doing. So then after about 3 months, we were all back in the library with our mask on and social distancing from our coworkers and only doing curbside service for our patrons for, hard to remember now, another 4 or 5 months. So that was weird in itself too, because nobody could eat lunch at the same time or in the same place. So it was still kind of hard to connect. Then fast forward back to 2023, and the librarians at Jefferson County locations had the opportunity to occasionally work from home. At my location, it turned out to be about once a month, and I would take advantage of it from time to time, but most of my work is face-to-face with patrons. So I didn't do it very often unless I was taking a training or leading a meeting. And I kind of missed the camaraderie in the office. Now, some people do enjoy working from home. They say they can focus better. I mean, I get that. We work in a very small room with usually 6 other staff people in there at the same time who might be talking, singing, because they're practicing their story times or playing music. But because I work on the service floor at least 4 hours every day, it just doesn't make sense for my position to work from home very often. In other careers, like my husband has, who works from home and he swears he likes it. But when I get home from work, he talks my ear off. So I think he gets lonely. So, it works for some people. It doesn't work for all of us. And we have to really make an effort to alleviate those feelings of loneliness when you're working in your own little bubble at home.
Well, thanks so much. I also want to remind people that we can even be lonely when we're surrounded by people. And so really thinking about like each of us is really unique in the way that we're approaching our own work life. And so really thinking about what gives us energy and joy. I think for a lot of people, sometimes it's just, I need to be able to focus. And other people like myself really crave having that personal connection. So for question number 8, how can employees take proactive steps to combat loneliness, both individually and collectively? And we're going to have Beth kick this one off.
Yeah. So I will say to start this off, when I researched this question, at least, a lot of the stuff that comes up is how employers can tackle loneliness. And I think that makes sense because supervisors and managers play a critical role in building up their teams and creating opportunities. But I will say my previous job before I became a supervisor, I was in a more employee type role. So I'm going to draw from some of that and then have some examples that I did find through my research. So for being an employee and taking proactive steps, there are a couple things. My previous team, I was really lucky to have a really, really strong team who had a lot of camaraderie. And something that we did was really being proactive and taking steps to get to know each other outside of work. So we were very intentional about creating opportunities, and those turned into, we created a book club that's still ongoing. I'm still part of it, even though I'm not part of that team anymore. Writing groups. We had team members who loved to host and have parties at their houses. They would plan these big work parties. And something that I want to mention with that is all of those opportunities were given to all staff. So it was everybody in the team had the opportunity to join if they wanted to, which helped it not become a clique. And also, it was, if you didn't want to, that's fine. You don't have to. But people who did crave connection and wanted to make friends outside of work got the chance to be involved. And I will say a lot of those connections that were made, I still have, which I am so happy about. even being in a completely different role in a completely different organization. And then something else that I have done and that I've seen other team members do is that when you are someone who has been in your organization for a while, when you've been on a team for a while, you do have the opportunity to help new team members come into that team and be integrated. So I've witnessed people who have welcomed me and welcomed others when they were new and taken on informal mentorship roles. So inviting them to establish social groups, making sure they feel welcome and included, helping with their onboarding and training. And this is something that was done even when not asked by supervisors or managers, or even when the supervisors of those teams were not doing the work that they needed to create strong teams. That was something that those team members who had the ability and the desire to do that stepped in, which was really awesome and helped create those strong connections. And then just briefly, I'll just include 6 suggestions and that I found in my research. So if these appeal to you, you can try them out. So number 1 is to validate yourself, to acknowledge that you may be feeling loneliness or isolation. Acknowledging the emotions that we have helps them to not get so big and overwhelming as when we ignore them and push them down. So that's really important to gently acknowledge this is what I'm feeling as a first step. And then 2 is to connect with teammates. And if this is something that's out of your comfort zone, doing little things that feel comfortable. So some of the suggestions I found was maybe asking a coworker to coffee or to have lunch over Zoom if you work remotely, starting really small, like maybe taking time to maybe walk around your workspace and say hi to everyone. Those really, really small baby steps. 3 is to switch up routines. So maybe if you take a break by yourself every day, seeing if you can invite a coworker or coworkers in that break. Maybe have a running board game going that you and your team members participate in over several breaks. If you're remote, maybe trying to find other remote workers who live near you to meet up for lunch or coffee. 4 is to look, excuse me, is to look for social opportunities, seeing what is already established at your organization, or if it isn't, maybe trying to create one yourself. And then 5 is to acknowledge your impact, to get feedback from your coworkers and supervisors to really understand your role in the organization and what you bring to the table. And then number 6 is to address loneliness in your personal life. So sometimes, I think Marie touched on this, when you don't have as many opportunities at work to create connection, it's really important to still create opportunities outside of work in your personal life. So it's not as daunting and overwhelming. As some examples they give was to try volunteering, strengthening existing connections you have, participating in hobbies that involve others, and just putting yourself out there in some sort of social connection, whether that be a class or whatever, that will increase your social life outside of the workplace as well.
All right, we're going to be heading into the question and answer period in one moment. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. But I also want to take the time to really, take a really quick cleansing breath. This was been a lot of information. And so if you want to breathe in with me and breathe out. Breathe in and breathe out. And get a little movement in your body if you want to do that. We're going to be heading into the question and answer, and I think we have 1 or 2 questions in the chat box already. So if Christine, can you just read them out to us?
As soon as I find them. Okay, so one of the questions that came up kind of early was when we were talking about EDI and how making sure that we are trying to be like equally welcoming to people and not othering people. So somebody wrote that does it feel like EDIE or EDI efforts are being tackled less enthusiastically than initially? It feels harder to explain the importance than it did 2 years ago, and I can't figure out why. And there was a little bit of comment around it, including that corporations are kind of backpedaling against those initiatives, and that change can be hard and it takes like a really long time. And so it can be hard to kind of keep the momentum. But I didn't know if anybody on the panel or anybody who is attending has some other thoughts around that.
I'll kick this one off. So for me, when I think about it, I work in higher education, and a lot of the studies have been kind of tracking is that a lot of the EDI offices, a lot of the affinity groups are all changing their names. Librarians are changing their job titles, removing departments in order to comply with a lot of the rules and regulations across the country, or they're doing it proactively. And so I think that the movement in libraries nowadays is to be more passive and trying to get ahead of what they fear of retaliation. And so I think in some ways, people in the building, library employees, and sometimes patrons feel like they're unsupported, that they're not being seen or heard in what's happening. And so I think for a lot of people who coming from marginalized communities, who feel like they might be targeted by some of these rules and regulations about what they write and what they say, they really do feel like their administration and the people they work with and even the people in their community aren't as supportive. And so I think it goes back to this idea, at least for me, that part of showing up for people is telling people that they're seen and that they're heard. And so I think in a lot of ways, one of the things I get when I give a presentation like this oftentimes is, what can I do when my boss or administration or my library system won't allow me to do these things? And I always tell people to start in small ways. There's 1,000 problems wrong with the world, and you can be the solution to one of them. And so maybe that solution is really small. Like maybe you say hello in the morning, and that's all you can do. Or maybe you're kind to somebody. And so thinking about, sometimes it's like we have to think about those big issues, but what can we do as an individual? And maybe that thing is just saying hello, and that hello makes that person's day at the end of the time. Does anyone else have any thoughts they want to share?
I can just add on to that. I actually just finished taking through the Association of Talent Development, a DEI in talent development course, like how to build it into your trainings and that kind of stuff. And there was a lot of talk about things that are happening in the United States. But one of the things that stuck with me was as we were having conversations about kind of pushing back from those using those terms, is you don't have to use the terms to do the work. So as Alejandro said, like we can still make our libraries very welcoming and engaging places without calling it EDI. We can still do the same actions and, making sure that staff feel included and patrons feel included without calling it out. Because realistically, as Alejandro just said, it's more actions than talking about it. There was another question that I believe that we addressed. So Laura, you can let us know about that. But talking about how do we make sure that our colleagues aren't included from the collective culture of the team, especially if you have new people joining the department, and where there might be experience and educational gaps. So I think, in Colorado, like many other states, we have a lot of library staff who don't have the MLS degree, which can also be a way of othering people on kind of on both sides. So I know we talked a lot about kind of different strategies, with team building and that kind of thing. I didn't know if anybody else had other examples that they wanted to share.
I was thinking about that when Alejandro was speaking about just the one thing. Like you're doing what you can by saying hello and being welcoming. Um, so keep on doing that. And I also, in all this conversation, being on the admin team, I think that there's a lot that admin has really good intentions. I know my admin team is trying really hard, but I also recognize, and part of why I've included it part of this group with the mental health discussion um, in through the Colorado State Library is being aware of the disconnect between the high up good intentions and the actual work and relationships that are happening among staff. And so, Laura, you're doing your part is the one thing, and then also just helping administration and managers understand where there might be intention that isn't being fully realized. So those are just a couple of thoughts on that.
And I like what you said, Rachel, about kind of trying to make sure that you are seeing where some of those discrepancies might lie between sort of like those good intentions and everything. Because I think that too many times in any organization, whether it's libraries or not, you have the culture that is spoken, and then you also have the unspoken culture. And different people in the organization may not even know that the unspoken culture exists. So I think being kind of aware of what your culture is and being kind of open about it. And also, Rachel, as you were talking, I was thinking like really having a good onboarding strategy. Um, I've worked in organizations that have onboarded staff very well. And once again, that's still kind of that formal culture piece. But if you can get more staff members involved in that onboarding process from the director on down, then that person can feel supported all the way across. So, yeah.
Yeah, to jump off of that point, Christine, I think the initial like team building is so important, but there's an initial aspect of team building in the hiring process, like really being intentional about who is my team, what type of personalities are going to fit really well in my team. Because so if you don't have that in the back of your mind, you don't think about that, you could have teams that are very disjointed where you have yeah, just very, very differing personalities, very differing work styles, and that could be a challenge as well. So I think it starts right at the very, very beginning of the process.
Something else I've been thinking about is like how I believe a lot of teams are very welcoming. And so within a team, somebody who might feel like an outsider otherwise is welcome, honestly, in that team. And then you have admin and managers who are doing their best. But then I think about the silos between different departments. So reach out to the new person in a different department who was in the break room or you pass by, because I think there might be a team of 10 people and sure you feel welcome there, but what about the other 80 people in the building? And that disconnect and lack of belonging among the bigger organization and the whole team can still leave somebody feeling very lonely. So that's something I've been thinking about is
All right, we have another question in the chat. And this one asks about loneliness when you don't have standard librarianship. And so they mentioned that they are working in disability services and outreach. I can also imagine that people who are working with um, the housing insecure populations or the immigrant and refugee populations. And how does that look like for people who might be experiencing loneliness when you don't fit that standard librarianship model? And if anyone has any ideas of how they might look at that. And I can kind of kick this off. When I worked at a very urban library, we had a lot of housing insecure people come through. And so our normal population was student, staff, and faculty of our university. And because we were a public institution, we had a lot of community members come through. And so it's this weird balance we try to do where we try to be as inclusive as possible, but also knowing that we didn't have the resources that we might have wanted in order to serve this population. And so really thinking about like what is our time, money, and energy that we can give in order to make the situation better. And I think a lot of times as library professionals, we have this case of vocational awe where we really want to do as much as possible for as many people as possible. And so, I mean, we really tried to bend over backwards to make it happen. And at the same time, it's just really this weird conversation we're having in librarianship about what is our goal. Like, we're not doctors, we're not social workers, we're not. We're just not everything for everybody. And we feel bad at the same time. And so I kind of wonder sometimes about, if we have so much passion, where do we funnel it through? And I think my last thought is, as library workers, we're not taught how to care for ourselves, let alone other people. And so this idea of care, like, how do I care for myself to keep myself sane? And how do I care for other people? Knowing that's probably not one of our core duties, and yet it definitely feels that way a lot of times.
We get everybody's questions answered. I'm trying to scroll back through the chat. If we haven't, we've got just a few minutes if you want to. Oh, there's one. I'm struggling with how to genuinely address loneliness of very social libraries, or I'm sorry, social employees who are in a role that requires that they work alone a lot of the time. Yeah, that's a big one. Thank you for asking. Anybody have some thoughts about that?
I'm wondering if there's ways to help them build in things to their work that gets them out there, like maybe parts of their job that can be a little bit more social or less alone. Like I know Christine did a really great CalCon presentation about job crafting, and thinking about what parts of your job you want to spend the most time doing and what parts you can spend less time doing, and really looking at all of the things that you do in your day-to-day work that speak to your strengths and your passions. And so maybe meeting with them and talking about there's time that can be built into their work days and their work that is a little bit less alone, where they could um, work with other teams or shadow other jobs or um, create new social things.
Yeah, I was also thinking of like sharing their expertise somehow, whatever it is that they're working on. They probably, especially if they are spending that much time alone, they might be an expert in it. And then in chat, there's a couple other suggestions, relying heavily on professional organizations to help with that connection piece, if there's a way that they could get involved with, or library association or other groups? Are there committees, especially if they might meet in person? Are there conferences that they could attend, or a way that they could collaborate on projects? Those are all really great ideas. And I know we're running short on time, but I know the loneliest I felt was during the pandemic, when we had a lot of staff turnover at the state library where I work. And so we hired really great people, but sort of like there wasn't a great onboarding process for them. And I also had like several managers in the course of like 4 years. And so like, I kept like trying to like grasp onto the things that I had done before, and I'm okay working alone, but I was feeling like I also wasn't having an impact at the same time. And so really trying to reach out and kind of make those connections where I could collaborate with other people, and really trying to figure out what that looks like. And that's going to look different for other people. Yeah. And once again, we're back to the toughest part for that is that activities are mostly geared for extroverts. I will say I am an introvert who does training for a living, which is odd. I get it. But committees can be different if you have the opportunity to sit on them, especially if you are passionate about them, because it can be more one-on-one or small group conversation versus going to a conference or something like that. So I appreciate the comment about that. And is there just a small job that they could do each day that would involve making contact with coworkers? So these are great ideas. We have reached the end of our hour. It went by so fast. So I first and foremost want to thank all of the attendees for joining us today. I love everything that everybody put in chat. I'm going to take some of the suggestions that you guys put in chat and share that anonymously along with the archive when it gets posted. But I also really want to thank our panelists for agreeing to share with us today, and for being open and vulnerable about the loneliness that they have experienced. As stated before, the recording will hopefully be available by tomorrow, if not by Friday. And I will send everybody who registered an email when it is ready, along with an anonymous survey that you can, where you can share your thoughts about today's panel. If you need a certificate for today's session, I'll also include that in the email, but I'm going to put my email in chat right now if you want me to email you a certificate. And I hope everybody has a really great rest of their afternoon.